Thank you very much, and to everyone who's made what has been a very interesting day. Okay, so I'm kind of a quick overview of what I'm going to say. I think there's a window of opportunity to build a relatively open, more humane immigration system. And that's basically for the reason that we heard in the last session, that public opinion has shifted. But we really want to build a system that's going to have some staying power, that isn't just going to, be there for a while and then disappear. And in order to do that, you've kind of got to think about what might go wrong, what the risks and dangers are, to be aware of them and mitigate them where possible. And so that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about perception of loss of control, gaps between rhetoric and reality, overreaching, overselling, and numbers. Sounds a lot, but actually a lot of these things are kind of related. And probably if at any time immigration appears as a major political issue in some of those statistics that we saw in the previous session, then immigration is probably going to be a problem at that point. So no news is good news when it comes to immigration. Okay, so I'll just sort of run through those. Perception of loss of control. I mean, this is just really reiterating what Sophie said in the last session. People do not like the feeling that immigration is out of control. Small boats now, free movement post-2004, the US southern border, these kind of things. People feel very uneasy about it. Even if numbers are small, they may well worry about the trends, they may be small now, but what are they going to be in the future? And currently in the UK, small boats is the main risk here. Now, my view is that we sort of know how to end small boats. And the reason we do that is because there have been similar episodes in different countries, in different places, and they've always ended pretty much in the same way, which is you have an agreement with the country of departure, immediate departure, which in this case would be France, and basically that agreement has got in it returns of everybody who crosses in a boat to France. So the journeys are just immediately undone. Obviously, you have to offer something to France to get them to agree to that. And that's not easy, but I think that's where diplomacy comes in. You have to try. My view is that should involve more safe and legal routes, acceptance of the UK, that it's always had less than its fair share of refugees and asylum seekers within Europe, primarily because the Channel has been seen as a physical barrier, which it is, but less so than people thought in the past. And so it's that combination of basically returns and safe and legal, which are the two components you've got to be aiming for. Now, in that proposal, there's something for everyone to like, but also something for everyone to hate. Take your pick. The second thing relates to what I call gaps between rhetoric and reality, but I think Sophie perhaps called it sort of transparency. So sometimes there's a gap between the stated intention of a policy and what the actual outcome is. And, when that happens, that again undermines public confidence in the system quite a lot. I mean, Colin, I think it was very eloquent that in the case of the illegal, it's migration bill, is it? Yeah, migration bill. That there's very likely to be a big gap between the rhetoric and the reality. But it's true in a lot of other aspects of the immigration system. So when people propose a particular visa, they normally have a purpose for that visa. But what they're thinking about, we want this visa to do this, but people don't really think enough about what can go wrong with that visa, how it might end up being used in a different way to what was intended. And then you get a gap between the rhetoric and reality. And I think that, for example, that means really doing due diligence on visa design in the first place, and monitoring and evaluating visas. And actually, again, I think Madeline and Jonathan spoke about that in an earlier session, that we just don't really do very much of that. So, for example, at the moment, the post-study work visa is an example of a visa where I don't think due diligence was done. Jonathan blamed it on the Home Office recently. I blame it on the Department for Education. But I just think they knew, there were fairly clear risks to it. They were just not interested in them. They just went ahead. The current rate of growth, I'm not really sure that's going to prove a sustainable policy if it carries on growing at the current rate. But we will see. The second kind of, the next thing is what I call kind of overreach. So there's always a lot of business lobbying to loosen restrictions on work or student migration. That's not just connected to Brexit. In any country, if you go to and you talk to them about their immigration policy, you're going to see this business lobbying. It's always going to be presented as being what the business wants is in the wider public interest. You're never going to get someone saying, I want this because it's going to be great just for me. They're always going to put it around, in a wider kind of context. And often what they say, what is best for business, is best for Britain, but not always. So I think you kind of should be sceptical. And on many issues, scepticism of business, there's a segment of opinion that scepticism of business comes quite easily. If business say we want lower taxes, we want a lower minimum wage, we want fewer rights for workers, there's a whole group of opinion that quickly jumps in and starts critiquing that. But those natural skeptics of business tend to be very in favour of immigration. And so when it comes to immigration-related issues, you don't get that level of scepticism of business. And that leads to what in the past, Gary Freeman argued was an expansionist bias in immigration policy. He argued that liberal democracies tend to have a tendency for immigration to run ahead of public opinion, to be more liberal than the public want. And basically he said that because organised opinion, what he called organised opinion, is generally in favour of a more liberal immigration system. And that's why when you look in many polls in many countries, most of the time, the public want a more restrictive immigration system than they currently have. And the problem with that gap, and so he was not saying that public are right or organised opinion are right, he's just saying there is a gap. This is why there is a gap. And the problem is that leads to building resentment among people who have anxieties or skepticism about immigration. And eventually that emerges in some form of populism, which takes different forms in different countries, but basically every high-income country has had that. And we've been through one such period. I don't know if you look at the current bill, you'd say we're still in it. Other things you might say we're coming out of it. But then what happens is you get this swing towards a much more restrictive policy, and you may well end up in a worse situation than if you'd not expanded so much in the first place. And that's what I call overreach. And UK policy has just swung, lurched from one end to another over time, and I think we'd have been much better if we could have had a much steadier course throughout. Then there is sort of what I would call overselling. So when we look at debates about immigration, it's often very binary, immigration good versus immigration bad. It's often very polarised, immigration very good versus immigration very bad. And basically what that means is both the costs and benefits of immigration are routinely exaggerated if you look at people writing and commenting on immigration. And I'll kind of give some examples of these commonly expressed economic arguments for immigration that are not, sometimes are regarded as self-evident truths, but I just don't really think they are. I get up in the morning, I read the newspapers, I play immigration economics bingo, and normally I've got all of these by about 8:30 in the morning. So first of all, the economy needs migrants, the needs of the economy. The economy is not some god that we've got to placate with offerings. Ultimately, it's about how immigration affects people's lives, and we've got to keep focus on that. So I suspect I've used the phrase the needs of the economy in the past, and perhaps even in the present, but I just kind of don't like it. Shortages mean we need migrants. Shortages we're talking about in many of these sectors today in Britain are always caused by poor paying conditions. No employer group is ever going to tell you that. So for example, we're short of people who want to do these jobs, not who are able. So for example, in the first session this morning, someone gave a name of a specific company, Bernard Matthews, and they've done so much to try and recruit local workers, and it's just not possible. Whenever I hear that, I go on the internet, look up what are the jobs that company is offering right now. So what is Bernard Matthews offering today? It's offering a night hygiene operative. I think that's the word for a cleaner. It's on the night shift. I suspect it's in a food processing factory. It's a pretty unpleasant job, I suspect, and so on. And they're offering 50p above the minimum wage. And I just wouldn't describe that as they have done so much to try and attract other workers. So I'm kind of encourage people's skepticism. Immigration is good for growth. In Liz Truss, lots of people said, well, obviously, if you want more growth, we need more. The obvious thing is more immigration. And in some sense, that's true, because immigration means more people, more GDP. But the effect on GDP per capita, which is what we should really be aiming for, is much less clear. And finally, immigration and ageing. Again, lots of people say we need immigrants to prevent ageing. No serious demographic analysis finds that immigration has more than the most marginal effect on ageing. And yet that is, again, that's something that isn't really out there. So I think if you sort of believe in these arguments, you start overselling the benefits of immigration, and that's not going to end well. Numbers, I'll say a little bit about this, came up. So focusing exclusively on numbers is a really bad idea and a really stupid idea. But I think it's wrong to think numbers are irrelevant. And if we think about the current level of numbers in the UK, we have like net migration of 500,000. I think that's very likely to fall. But imagine that it was going to continue. I doubt that will be politically sustainable. It means population growth of 0.75% per year. You've got to increase all your infrastructure at that rate, or else you're going to get stresses and strains. That's quite challenging. It would mean the migrant share is going to rise about 5 percentage points over a decade. And if you had it for decade after decade, we would end up with a country that was 40% migrant. And that's quite different from where we are today. So they're I think it's not, I don't want to be sort of alarmist about that. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, because I think net migration is likely to fall. But clearly there are risks on work and study. I think Madeline put up those graphs of work and study visas. They are just growing extremely fast. If that growth continues at that pace, I think this is kind of not going to be very unlikely to be a sustainable system. Personally, I would like us to have a more open, humane policy on family and asylum, but I think there's a risk that that gets crowded out by work and students, business, universities being very aggressive on their migration. I'll just sort of finish by sort of making one thing, is that basically, unless you believe in open borders now, immigration policy really means saying yes to some people who want to move to the UK and no to others. Some people will say yes to lots of people, others fewer. But our discussion is often not like that at all. So on the one side, we have people who are very, very clear about who they would say no to, but it's much harder to work out who they would say yes to. And on the other side, those who are very clear who they would say yes to, but really quite a difficult vague about who would they say no to. And these two groups, great deal of mutual suspicion. And personally, one of the things I learned on the Mac was that you actually have to make a recommendation. What would you actually do? And saying, well, I wouldn't do that, that actually doesn't really cut it. At the end of the day, you've got to say, well, I wouldn't do that, this, and this, but I would do that. You've got to come down on something. And I personally think that being as clear as you can about who you would say yes to and who you would say no to is quite important. I will try to do that in response to any questions, but then again, I don't often practice what I preach, so I'll leave it.
Thank you very much.